Hi, I'm Abby Romberger. I am doing a presentation for educators on assessment. I am focusing on self assessment, peer assessment, and reflection. So, self assessments with peer assessment and reflection have become one of my main focuses since I started taking some more graduate classes because I feel like it just kind of keeps coming up over and over again. And so, actually, one of my goals for me this year is to have my students do more self assessment, peer assessment, and reflection in my classroom. And I've already started looking at different ways, and I'm actually going to talk about some things that I found in the mathematical mindset book that I've liked, and other things. So let's dive in and figure out what these things are. So, self assessment is occurring whenever learners are assessing their own performance. So, with practice, they are going to learn to objectively reflect on and critically evaluate their own progress and skill development. um, that's going to be the big part there, is really looking back and being true about where they really feel that they are in their progress and in their skills. And we're going to talk about different strategies that you can do as the teacher to help the students realize um, and be able to do that critical evaluation of their own progress. We also want students to be able to identify gaps in their understandings and capabilities. So, is it just a small piece that they're not understanding? Or is it the whole topic? What is happening here? Is it a skill from prior knowledge? And so, thinking about things like that. And then students are also going to discern how to improve their performance. So that's going to be a big thing, is talking about how they can improve. Some kids already think, well, I already understand this, so I can't go any further. And so our goal is to kind of, help with that and figure out, where can you actually go. And then this is also going to help students learn independently and think critically. That's going to be a huge thing. A lot of the students, I think, want to be told, what they know, and they don't really want to do any of that self-assessment. They want the teacher to be like, I can see that you don't understand this, instead of saying, I don't understand this. So in my research, I have found that there are four parts for effective self-assessment. There is the judgment of current status, so the student saying, this is where I am currently at for my learning target. This is where I am. And honestly, that is a major piece, because a lot of students potentially could either overthink and be overconfident, or actually be underconfident. So this next part, the justification for that judgment, is going to be key. So, as a teacher modeling, well, how do you know you are there? And what does that look like? I'm showing that student that. Having the students create a goal for themselves, and then also a plan of what to do next. So I'm going to reference this book a couple of different times in this presentation. It's the Classroom Assessment for Student Learning. I found it to be extremely eye-opening towards assessments, and was a driving force between the self-assessment, peer assessment, reflection piece that I picked, which was kind of nice. And when I was reading chapter 8 of the mathematical mindsets and getting into that assessments, and referring back to different things that she had talked about earlier in the book too, about reflections. And then also another book I've been reading, Evolving Education, has had a couple of strong points as well. And so in the Evolving Education book, they say that the self-assessment allows students to take ownership of the learning process. And that right there really stands out to me. Like, that is a key thing. Students need to be able to take ownership of what they are doing. I think nowadays they don't understand that. And I think it's hard for them to understand how to take ownership of it. I think sometimes they even think that they are. Um, and I really think it will help them also then become a better learner, a better mathematician, and just really better overall if they can be involved in their learning process. I mean, it's their learning. And so I do feel like students need to be more involved with it, and it's part of my goal for this upcoming school year. So I also have a goal here for self-assessment, right? So students need to visualize what to adjust and be their own editor. Um, I do test corrections in my classroom, and I think sometimes they're so quick to just ask the person next to them, hey, did you get question 3 right? Well, what'd you get? And not actually look back at what they did to see what they did wrong. They just want to know the right answer. And so I really want to shift gears and say, I don't care what the right answer is. Like, I'll tell you what the right answer is. I want you to focus on what is it that you did incorrectly and what can we learn from that. Mistakes are going to happen, so let's learn from them. I think this mathematical mindset book has done a wonderful job of different ways to help have that conversation and help students realize that mistakes are okay and actually they're better. Like those first couple of chapters really were like, great, this is exactly what I want to focus on for this upcoming school year. All right. Obviously, there are benefits to self assessment. It helps students develop important metacognitive skills that contribute to a range of important graduate capabilities. Um, Out in the real world, you need to be able to self assess and be able to figure out, are you understanding this? Are you able to do the work that's being asked of you? Employers are going to want that. Self assessment is going to increases student self awareness through reflective practice. So it makes the criteria for self evaluation evolution explicit, and making performance improvement practices intrinsic to ongoing learning. Basically, what I'm trying to say there is that students are going to want to know what they are doing wrong, and really taking it upon themselves to figure out what they're doing wrong to continue their learning. At some point, it's going to be an intrinsic motivation when they start doing the self assessment, because they're realizing that they're now taking that ownership. They're doing more involved in their learning, and so they can have that motivation to keep going. Excuse me. So we also have contributing to the development of critical reviewing skills. This also comes up in the peer assessment as well. It also helps students become more objectively to evaluate their own performance. Again, I think it really says to the kids, like, you know, I can tell you what you're doing wrong. I can recognize it, but I need you to recognize it, because at some point you're not going to have me to do that for you. So I teach Algebra 1. So they take the keystones. I also teach AP Pre-Calc. And so they're taking the AP test. So both of my classes are taking some sort of, standardized test. And they're not going to have me. So they need to be able to think through the problems and look back at their work and see if there are mistakes on their own. This also helps students take control of their own learning and assessment. I talked about that a little bit on their previous slide. Again, just helps them become a little bit more independent. And then also it gives students a greater agency regarding assessment, right? So they're going to be more involved in it, which means that they're going to feel more connection to those assessments. They're going to feel more powerful, like, hey, I have this role, and all of a sudden it means something to them, and it's not just this grade that goes in their grade book and something for them and their parents to talk about later. They're actually getting involved in having a say in their assessments and how they're doing and everything like that. Again, helping them take ownership of their learning. Obviously, some challenges, I think, with self-assessment. Struggling learners sometimes lack the skills to be able to figure out where they're going wrong. I think that's something that it's just going to be a struggle at first for them, because they aren't understanding the material. So sometimes it's going to be hard for them to figure out what it is that they did wrong if they're not even sure, what they're supposed to do. But I think if you take the time to really work with the students and continuously have them, maybe start comparing two works. Hey, what do you see here? What do you notice there? Why do you think that's right? Why do you think that's wrong? And really having those conversations. So maybe this being more of a one-on-one assessment time process first, and then getting to that self-assessment part. And then for lower performing and less experienced students, they also sometimes tend to overestimate their achievements. On the other side too, they could potentially underestimate if they're a high achieving student as well. Sometimes they might resist the self-assessment piece of this. I actually had a student that did this to me in the past. They were like, well, it's not for me to do. You're supposed to tell me what I'm doing wrong. And unfortunately, the parents weren't much help. But that's I think a very small percentage of students. I think very, very small. But I wanted to include that in here because I actually have had that occur to me, and It was very interesting. And eventually, I think they bought into it, but not fully. And it took a lot of work and a lot of time. Then the other problem that could happen is where their self assessment is not consistent with yours. So that's time to pull that student aside and really go through things one on one with them, and say, okay, I'm noticing this, but you're saying this, and it's or and the fact it keeps happening is really when you need to have that conference with that student and take the time to go through that, back to one of those 4 steps I said, that justification part, like why did you put yourself on this step, and really have those conversations with the students, and maybe having that one-on-one conversation will help the student be more aware of where they are at. Whenever you are creating a self-assessment for your students, there's some things to ask yourself. So like, how experienced are your students in self-assessing? um, I have found that sometimes actually my freshmen are better at self assessment because they had more experience in a middle school, whereas my juniors had a little more challenging because they haven't seen it in a while. And so that took some time to go through. Another question is, how do you want to introduce it to self assessment? So if they've never seen it before, or if maybe you have different expectations to what other teachers have done, how are you going to introduce this? I always like to go through a modeling example first. Well, this is how I did this. This is what I would rate myself, and go through it with the kids, and really go through it, and then have them kind of go through and check in with them and be like, oh, okay, what's your justification for that? And kind of go through those 4 steps. You also want to figure out how you can support your students as they are developing their self assessment skills. So think about, are you going to be doing check-ins? Are you going to be doing conferences? Are you going to have them submitted online and you can give feedback that way? Like, how are you going to do that? So those are just some questions that you should ask yourself. The other question is, what processes will I use to moderate the student self-assessment? So again, what is your plan? So before you can implement it in your classroom, you need to make sure you're thinking about what you're going to do before you ask your students to do something. So all these good things to ask yourself before creating a self-assessment for the students. Some different strategies: exposing your students to examples of mastery. Look at what this student did, and I would definitely keep it anonymous in the beginning. So that way they're getting just to look at what examples look like, and maybe even show side by side, hey, here, look at this example, see how they did this. Look at this example, see how they did this. Which one's right? Which one's wrong? Why not? And go through that. Um, Visual thinking strategies, they can go through post-it notes. Maybe it's just a quick post-it note that they're writing down. I also have a fishbowl discussion. I know it's not necessarily self-assessment, but I think it helps the students evaluate. I mean, honestly, when I'm thinking about this fishbowl discussion, I was thinking about, them reflecting and then getting in a group and them talking about their self-reflection, to show that they're not the only ones who are evaluating themselves. And then also to show that they are not maybe the only ones that are in the same place that they are. Sometimes I think the students are like, oh, I'm the only one struggling. And so maybe if you had this kind of discussion, they could see that they are not the only ones. And there's other people who are having issues as well. And then this next piece, I think, is a really helpful strategy: providing your students with the vocabulary to analyze the work. Such a huge, huge component. One, you need to make sure that the kids are using the same vocabulary as you. Maybe that's why they're not understanding the question. They don't understand the vocabulary. Or, two, maybe they had a tutor that used different language than you. I've had that happen before. So I have, ensuring that the teachers are using common vocabulary. Having a word board or a word wall, just so the students are there, they see it every day, they're aware of what the vocabulary is, what they're using. We need to make sure that we are teaching the kids how to give peer critiques. I've even talked about creating a verbal critique contract. So, what do we say to each other? What are words that we can use? What are words we can't? What should it look like, etc. As usual, we should navigate away from hurtful language, but also vague. Um, you know, that looks good. What is that, or like how the word it, right? So try and be intentional in the feedback, and the language that is there. Sometimes starting with a written critique is actually easier, um, because then they don't feel as nervous. Sometimes I feel like oral, they get nervous talking about it. Whereas writing it, they feel a little more free to do it. Not all students. Some students could be, opposite. But in my mind, I have found that students have like the written one first. Helping students understand why or they do or do not like something. So, instead of saying, I don't like the work you've done here, what is it about that work? Again, going kind of back to the vagueness and then also the vocabulary that are there. And then just helping with any critique discussions. And that could be in self assessment and in the peer assessment as well. So, all things are helpful also for the peer assessment here. So, some examples that I have found of self assessment that I have liked, I have a few actually. A reflective journal. And so, this also gets into the reflection piece of it. But they can, talk about where they're at and how they're feeling and why they're feeling that way. And that also gets into the reflection piece, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. Self-assessment prompts, also self-assessment stems. So there's a couple ways you can call them. I have a picture of a self-assessment stems over here. It gives a student a place to start. Sometimes they just don't even know where to go or how to start. And so this could help them get to just a place where they can talk about something before they can do it on their own. And then also if you're in a performance assessment, so quiz, test, something like that. Maybe at the end, give them a rubric. Have them identify where their strengths were at and where they thought they needed to improvement at. And if you've given them enough feedback on the rubric, then you've modeled the thinking that you could have done while they were like what they can do when they're self-assessing. Like that can help them set a specific and achievement related goals and also plan on how to accomplish them. So, having that rubric at the end really helps them go back to look, maybe question 2. What was it about question 2 that you weren't understanding? Was it vocabulary? Were you not understanding what the question was asking? Was it the math that was behind it? So it's interesting to see what students put on the rubrics on the back of a quiz or at the end of a test. They're very open and they're very truthful about how they feel about it. And don't just have them say how they felt, because students will be like, oh, I felt bad or I felt good. Give them a very specific rubric to say, very clearly, I struggled on question 2 because I wasn't sure where to start. Something like that. But you don't want to have it just be a very vague thing, because then the students they'll just say, I think I failed it, or yeah, I think I passed. And they don't actually get into that self-assessment piece, which is what our goal is. Some other examples that I have found that I've liked. So on page 160 and 161 in the mathematical mindset book that we're reading for class by Joe Baller, great self-assessment pieces there. I might be using the one that was for Algebra 1 because there was a lot of great things that came from that. My curriculum's a little different, but really, really liked that a lot. And then the other one is from that Classroom Assessment for Student Learning book. And so, here it looks like it doesn't look like it is a problem where they got something back and then they're saying what their learning target was, if they got it right or wrong, and if they see the mistake or don't get it. Great introduction to self-assessment. Very clear. Did you understand it? Or did you see the mistake? I don't understand the mistake and I don't see it. And that really can lead to a lot of wonderful conversations between students and the teacher. And it's just, it lets us see how lost they are, and also if they can do that self-assessment piece in it and looking back and really analyzing their work. And sometimes great people who can self-assess be like, I still don't see my mistake, and that is okay. And we want students to know that as well. The other one is a self-assessment piece, but also has some goal setting. So it's like, what is your goal? Where you are now, what you need to work on, how you're going to close that gap. So kind of a self-assessment, goal setting, reflection, kind of all tied into one piece there. But I really liked how that was set up. I think it's very clear and straightforward, and the students would be able to follow it. So peer assessment is something that I do not do a lot of in my classroom, but something I would like to do more of. And so peer assessment is a process in which students provide feedback to other students, right? That's exactly what it is. The interesting thing is, so feedback, right? It's a learning activity. And the student learning benefits when the students receive feedback, but also when they give the feedback to their peers. Because whenever they're giving that feedback to their peers, they're strengthening their understanding, which is helping them assess their learning and also in growing. It's kind of one of those things like, if you're able to explain it to somebody, then it shows that you can understand. If you're able to explain to somebody, that usually means that you're understanding something. But it also allows students to talk to each other. And sometimes kids are way more willing to talk to each other than to the teacher. Not everybody, and it might depend on who they're talking with, but it can be effective. And so, mentioned in the mathematical mindset book here, right? Peer assessment has been shown to be highly effective, right? Because students are open to hearing criticism or changes to their work from another peer. And also, they talk in the same language, right? So, nowadays, sometimes the words kids are using makes me feel old and saying, like, I'm not even sure what they mean, but they understand each other. And I said, they're talking in terms and in ways that they understand and that they're comfortable, and that helps. In the Evolving of Education book, it says that peer feedback provides students an opportunity to get new ideas and eliminates blind spots. And I really didn't think about it that way. I thought about it, as getting feedback from each other, but I never really thought about it as getting a new idea. And so that could be even the instance where it's like, oh, I didn't even think to solve about it that way. That's a really cool way to solve it. I was keen of thinking in the critical mind of, oh, this is what you did wrong, and not thinking about it like, oh, that way's right, this way's right. Maybe we can talk and share different things. So that's kind of really cool. And so I liked that. It kind of brought a new mindset for me on peer assessment. So some needs and kind of almost challenges to peer assessments is um, you need to make sure you have the right culture in your classroom, right? So you need it to be supportive. You need it to be a collaborative relationship between not only you and the students, but students to students. And there has to be that mutual trust. So I know some teachers that create like a contract. And I think I mentioned it up in the self-assessment as well. You can easily make one for peer assessment. Making sure you're not using that hurtful language, not the vague language when you're talking to each other. And so teachers really need to make sure we're educating students on how to give that constructive feedback and how to assess fairly. Um, Making sure it's not just because you like the person that they did it right, looking at the actual math behind the things. Highly recommend practice sessions. I remember a couple years ago, I watched one of my fellow teachers in a school I used to teach at where he had them working in groups, and he was constantly writing things, and they're popping up on the board because it was being projected on what he was typing on. And I was like, what are you doing? And I couldn't understand because the words in my mind didn't make sense. But then I finally asked him, and he said that what he was doing was recording words that he heard them using in their conversations. So by looking up there, you could see if they were on task or off task. He was like, I'm not looking to look at their math today. I'm looking to hear how they're actually collaborating with each other. And like, these are words I'm hearing. Like, instead of let me do it, have you thought about this? And just showing the students and modeling to the students ways to actually work together. But it was really interesting because the students knew that was his focus that day, was listening to how they were working as a group and the words and languages that they were using. And I think that would be interesting to see modeled in a peer session, so that you can see how peer assessment works. So I almost would bring in another teacher solve the problem, the both of us exchange it kind of thing, and look through each other's work and model to the students how we would do that peer assessment. Right? Or maybe if two students would be willing, have them go through it and model to the class as well. Because ultimately, that's what the students need to be able to see is how it's actually done and correctly. So it's not necessarily one giving wrong feedback or hurtful feedback. At no point do I want a kid to feel that they're in a position where someone is making them uncomfortable or, bullying them or whatever, making them feel dumb or something like that, because that's not the whole idea between peer assessments. And I don't want that in my classroom. Hopefully, nobody does, right? I've been obviously this need to make sure that you're monitoring the process. Depending on how large your class is, that can be a challenge, and making sure that you are able to get around and listen to the peer assessment happening and intervene or provide guidance if needed. So on page 165 in the mathematical mindsets, there was an example of peer assessment that was really nice. It was just 2 stars and a wish. So going back in the book to look at that is something I would recommend doing. And then I also have the peer assessment stems, kind of like those prompts I had for the self-assessment. And again, just gives kids a starting point. Sometimes that's all they need, a place to start. Did you tell them about this part? Have you talked about what could be clearer? Did you think about what they could add? Now, this is, I think, a little more helpful for, like a language arts and social studies, but it's still not bad with math in the fact that, this part is very clear. I can see you're having trouble with this, or a next step could be. So there are definitely pieces here that work really well for a math class as well. So the last piece in the presentation is reflection. And honestly, the self-assessment is happening, or there's reflection happening in the self-assessment, right? So reflection is increasing the student learning. It is supporting a growth mindset. It is encouraging students to improve and learn from their mistakes. And having students reflect on what they've done in class is huge. So is there a daily learning target that they could reflect on? So I want to change how I've done this. In the past, I've had kids, fill out a summary of what we did today, but I never really had them reflect on what they felt for today. Like I just said, take something from today. So I'd be interested to see what that would look like to have them go, tell me how you feel about today. So I've done it here or there, but not on a regular basis. And so I'm interested to have that in something I implement in my class this year. And then also, if they're setting goals for the unit, can they reflect on it throughout the unit, or is it at the end of the unit test, kind of like that rubric that was on the end of that performance that we've talked about? But having that reflection piece and going through how this unit go for you, what could have gone differently, what could you do differently, what could I do differently, and go through and just really reflect upon that piece. I have this quick check-in because I actually feel like I got my kids to kind of reflect every day in my pre-cal class, because every day I asked the kids, how'd your homework go? So, it's kind of interesting. You don't really see that as a reflection, but they reflected on how it went and how they felt about it. And by the end of the year, they weren't just trying to copy down, number 7 from the one kid that understood it. It finally was I didn't know how to do number 7. That's why it's blank. And that's what I wanted to get to. I wanted to get to the point where they were open about how they were feeling. So that part of that self-assessment, being honest about it, and having that just be a quick, okay, like, let's go over that one then. So just a quick, it does take a little bit of time, and I know time is something we all value, but it is worth it. And then also a routine. If you just reflect here and then reflect, maybe September and then in February and then in May, it's not going to do anything, right? Make it into the routine. Have it actually mean something to the students where they are used to it. They get to that point, because having that reflection piece will help them become better self-assessment students and ultimately help them become better learners. And engaging students regularly and noticing and reflecting on their own progress, they actually will start doing it on their own, like without you telling them to do it. And they'll start doing it in other classes as well. And so having that just be, again, that routine will help them start doing it on their own, and starting to actually click in and, again, get to the point where they are becoming involved in their own learning. And that's going to be that huge piece. We need the kids to be taking ownership of their learning. All right, so obviously there are benefits to reflection, kind of, I think, goes along to the self-assessment, but they're becoming self-aware. They're helping with their self-improvement. They're getting to the point where they can identify their strengths and weaknesses. They're setting goals and developing strategies. This helps with enhancing their critical thinking and problem solving skills. The more that they are reflecting and becoming true to themselves, they are understanding their thinking and where they are truly at, which helps with their self-assessment and helps with their problem solving skills overall. An effective way for students to become knowledgeable about the ideas they're learning is to provide some class time for reflection. And I have an example from the book as well that I really liked. In fact, I marked right on the book, use this next year, because I want to make sure that this is something that I started implementing in my class, and that's mentioned here in a slide or two. And then learning is a process that involves effort, mistakes, reflection, and refinement of strategies. I think that's a wonderful statement. It talking about the effort that is given. You need to make sure you're putting in some attempt, but that mistakes. Learning is a process that involves the effort and the mistakes, but then also reflecting back on those mistakes, or reflecting back on things that you did correctly as well, and then getting to the point where you're making that refinement for strategy. Like, I don't know. It just kind of sums everything up, I think, right there. Right? Learning is a process that involves effort, mistakes, reflection, and refinement of strategies. So, perfect way to lead into some examples and activities for reflection here. So, for reflection activities, students can blog about it. I don't know if students really blog anymore, but it was big when I first started teaching. I liked it. Digital storytelling. So, they could create a flip. They could make a lot of different videos really at this point. Making mind maps. So I have a concept map that I use in my class that I said I usually have them take something down about that day. I could turn that into something about, okay, how are you feeling? What are you taking away from today? And having with that. A teacher in my school does a lot of podcasting with his students. I have not gone into that, but I think it's an avenue that could be explored. And then building a digital portfolio. Having the students start putting some of their work together online. That could be a cool thing to see, and have the students build it and really say, hey, like, look at your progress that you've made. Look at this reflection. Look at where you've grown, and having that there. Another thing to help do, and I don't have any stems listed here, but you could kind of give one of those prompts and, model, even say, hey, I feel that this went well. I did not like this about this. Give times to the students to discuss, maybe give it a task and say, have this task, and then have them try it and then reflect on how the task went. And then maybe get together and kind of like a fishbowl discussion, or a whole group class discussion, and ask them what reflecting has done and how has it helped them, what has it taught them, and getting them to start having these conversations. This is something I would start doing in the beginning to help it become more routine throughout the course of the year. So some examples. So writing in a journal, blogging, something like that, podcasting, all different things. Portfolios. These were listed in the classroom assessment for student learning book, and they kind of went through different portfolios that you could do as a reflection piece. But again, kind of just takes all the student work, puts them together, and kind of shows the students their progress. One is about growth, one is their projects, one is different achievements they've had, and then, kind of like a celebration one as well. And so that math homework reflection questions on page 53, that's the one that I marked and said, this is something I need to make sure that I'm doing in my class. I thought it was great. I'm really interested to see what my students say. And I think, that was a huge takeaway for me for reflection and homework, because kind of a separate note, homework is something that, I struggle a lot with, and what I want my kids to do and not do on homeworks. So this was really a really nice addition to what I would like to start doing this next school year. And then the last thing that I have here is tracking and reflection on quiz or test results. And so you can kind of give them their assessment back, and has like, the learning targets on it, so they can go through and say, okay, these are what I've mastered, these are what I'm working on, and then mistakes that they need to be paying attention to. I really like the mistakes I need to pay attention to, because maybe they're keep making the same mistake, and so this is something that they could be like, man, I keep doing that. I need to make sure that I know that I need to stop doing this, and having that self-assessment piece in there is kind of key. And then here are some of my references that I have here. So here are my web sources that I have, and then also my books that I have used in this. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know.